Today we're excited to introduce Professor Wilbard Kombe from RD University in Dar es Salaam, and also the head of the Institute for Human Settlements at RD. Professor Kombe and I have been working for a couple of years together. I'd originally invited him as an Institute for African Development Fellow several years ago, but because of the pandemic, it's sort of been got pushed a couple of years ahead. So we're very excited to finally have him here. I'd like to acknowledge Ryan Thomas, who's also been working with Professor Kombe and has been an important resource for him in Dar es Salaam. Professor Kombe's research covers many aspects of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular land management, land regularization and formalization policies, but also urban inequality, the co-location of, or sorry, not co-production of infrastructure and services, urban vulnerability, inequality, and climate change. He's also worked on a lot of international collaborations with colleagues both in the States and in Europe that's been funded through the Ford Foundation and the UNDP, among other international agencies. And his work has a lot of policy relevance, in particular national policies in Tanzania dealing with housing, land management, and climate adaptation. I do want to make note of one aspect that's not actually in his formal biography, but is, I think, relevant to planning master's students. About 25 years ago, or 30, he can correct me, Professor Kombe, in conjunction with colleagues at the Technische Universität Dortmund, wrote a grant that was funded by the German Academic Exchange Program to support a international master's in planning. So this collaboration, the way it works out is effectively the students spend 1 year in Dortmund in Germany, and it's an English language program. And then the second year doing field research and working on a number of different projects across the global South with partner institutions in Ghana, Tanzania. I'd have to look at my list right now. Philippines, Brazil, and Chile. So anyway, it's called the SPRING program. This stands for Spatial Planning for Regions and Growing Economies. I think it potentially provides an excellent model for how to internationalize the planning curriculum and pedagogy. And it's certainly something worth looking at, and the students end up with an MS in planning at the end of those 2 years, as well as some significant field research project component at the end of that as well. So anyway, I've gone on long enough. Without further ado, please let us welcome Professor Wilbard Kombe.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the introduction and the good words about me and my experience, which I've had for the time I've been working in the area of urban planning and land management for quite a number of years. And thank you, colleagues, for coming and joining this session this afternoon. I trust that we'll share our experiences aimed by everybody, and I'm sure that you'll be own experiences in many things. What I'm going to present to you, sorry, and discuss with you a project which I was commissioned by World Bank to review the reforms which have been undertaken by countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, selected countries, with the purpose of trying to identify what measures they've taken to address the issue of land use plan and management, how successful are they, and where they are, and try to gather evidence from the ground, try to get reports from the existing development and literature to find out what reforms these countries are carrying out and try to identify area for intervention. The World Bank commissioned this work because of its concern in the region that a lot of development taking place in cities is not depicting effectiveness in terms of sustainable urban development. And because it has supported the region in many ways, many countries in many ways, in terms of training, in terms of capacity building and study carried on the country, it wanted to make a follow-up, but from the local context. Therefore, what I'm going to present to you, I'll introduce the subject matter. I'll present the context and peculiarities of sub-Saharan African cities, which gives the conditionalities for intervention. And then I'll try to explain the findings which I found from different countries. The countries which were selected by World Bank include Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and there's another country, but in this context, I'm going to present experiences and findings from Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Zambia, 4 countries which I'm going to focus on. And then I will also try to do emerging issues, which will come from those findings, and then conclusions. In terms of introduction, and what I'm emphasizing here is that urbanization, as it has been written in the literature, presents both opportunity and challenge. But in many sub-Saharan countries, this has remained largely a challenge in the sense that the trickle-down effect and the economics of agglomeration, which I expect to result from the urbanization, have not been realized in most of the cities in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And we are saying that land governance, which ought to enhance transparency, cross-sectoral collaboration, participation management. This thinking, which is embedded in many of discussions of the World Bank, which are embedded in many discussions of UN Habitat and other policy documents, even of the countries, has not been realized. The governance of land is not undertaken in form of transparency and cross-sectoral collaboration. Therefore, the intention was also to look at this issue. How is decision made in the land governance aspect, especially land use planning? Property rights and land values to harness land markets are essential. Recognition of the property markets and inherent values which ought to benefit the people have to be acknowledged. And comprehensive spatial regulatory instruments, master plans, strategic plans are necessary for regulating and for ensuring that legislation, regulation standards are essential and are in place. Also, intensive use of ICT, especially for land information management system, is essential. However, the political economy of cities matter, informing decision, and the informed decision in urban development, but often neglected by planners. This is another important observation that had to be looked at. Increasingly, sub-Saharan countries are reforming urban land use plan and management. There have been responses toward this direction. What we are also saying is that despite limited use, European concept and model of cities continue to influence land use planning. There has been a lot of talk about the inapplicability of European imported, the transfer, the circulating concepts and ideas in the sub-Saharan African cities. There's been a concern these are not applicable by and large, but these are still influencing decisions, particularly among policymakers and planners. There is a lot of wishful thinking among practitioners and policymakers that this will be one day realized, and therefore moving away from this has been a very difficult one. Population is growing very rapidly, and in most sub-Saharan Africa, urban population is doubling between 15 and 20 years. This is a huge change in urban areas, considering the resource and capacities to manage this development in cities. This is just to give an impression of the urbanization, which has been derived from African Development Bank. Urbanization in Africa is not associated with economic growth. This is another peculiarity. In many countries of the West, urbanization took place in the concurrent with economic development and in transformation from agriculture to manufacturing and service sector. This is not happening in the sub-Saharan, most sub-Saharan African cities. And urbanization is leading to poverty and not prosperity as it has been in the West. There are also major differences between what is happening in Africa, especially, and Asia and in Latin America. If you look at the trend, you realize that poverty level declined between 1990 and 2010, declined from 58% to 12% in Asia Pacific, but in sub-Saharan Africa, it remained at 45%. Urban population in Africa and Asia is about 40%, but per capita in Africa is 1/3 of Asian countries. What I'm trying to underscore is that we are living in urbanization of poverty, or in urbanization in poverty, which means the resource capacities of household and individuals and public, both local and central government, are low. Despite severe governance and management deficits, cities remain vibrant economic engine. This is not a helpless situation or hopeless situation, in the sense that despite all these problems I've mentioned, cities are playing important role. They remain very important centers of economic development, governance, as well as engine of growth. 60% of GDP is still generated from cities, despite their weaknesses. And we are saying cities are centers of political, social, technical, and economic transformation. Like the Western countries, cities are playing the same role despite their weakened position. Power of the cities and productivity, especially in functionality, increasingly depend on macro structure of capacity to respond to the socio-economic environment forces. Market forces, private sector is the major force transforming cities together with informality, but these are not producing functional and efficient cities. What I'm saying is that at present, most cities in Sub-Saharan Africa are driven by the real estate sector and market forces largely. But these are not leading to functional and efficient cities in terms of service delivery, access to goods and other services. Capacity of the state to regulate the market and guarantee property rights, reduce transaction cost is weakening. State has been weakened over the years, and this is still weakening, especially its capacity to regulate the market. Widening socio-spatial inequalities are outcome and polarization despite numerous efforts and actions. There has been a lot of action, both internally generated and externally influenced, especially by World Bank and bilateral organizations to support the countries to reform. But these have not yielded much in terms of addressing socio-spatial inequalities that are largely resulting from informality and lack of basic services across the cities. Why are the reforms necessary? Why were the reform considered necessary? One is that role of the government has to be revitalized. The position of the weakened government cannot continue. Critical players, they are important in reconciling public and private interests in urban land use. Therefore, they are important to reinforce and to support. They are important in providing policies, in providing regulations, and in providing and optimizing priority and services for the urban poor. It also state can enhance productivity, reduce transaction costs and well-being among the poor, and hence also enhance opportunity for inclusiveness of urban land use and planning and development. Create responsive regulatory framework. Provide the necessary regulatory framework in form of policies, laws, regulations, standards, which are necessary. What I'm saying in short is that states is a very important actor, and much as it's being marginalized, it cannot be considered not necessary. In my opinion, it's inevitable, it's indispensable actor in urban development, and it's necessary for the state to take its position, weak as it is. We are also saying that responses are necessary because supply-driven and reactive interventions have not much delivered. Slum clearance and low-cost housing simply starting in the 60s did not make a big difference. Certain services equally. Community infrastructure among the 90s did not make a big dent in the services. Invest in satellite towns, which has become a fashion in many sub-Saharan African cities, which I'll come to later, has not made a big difference either. City without slums, a very important thinking of the City Alliance program, little dent on the informality. Mass land use planning and layout plan, which we have done in many cities, including Dar es Salaam, was only a short-lived intervention. Informal settlement, formalization, regularization, mobilized lead capital has not really changed the lead capital into a collateral. It has not been able to paperize the collateral and provide the opportunity for the poor. This has been, like in Peru, Tanzania, and other many countries, remains a problem because formalization has not activated the capital, which they sort of did claim about. Reactive responses, constant external funding, huge financial outlays sector intervention, project-based. What I'm trying to say is that most of this intervention we are talking about, they are project-based, they are post-ante, they are reactive in the sense that they are following a process which has taken place already. As such, they are not addressing the core problem, limited impact on urban poverty, which is a key concern. Informality presents legitimate claims. Also, we are trying to argue that the idea which we are embedded in the thinking to reform was also to recognize the position of the informality as a legitimate claims in the real estate savings of the urban poor. And this was an important aspect. And it's also a structural manifestation of socioeconomic and political context of African urbanism, which has always been elusive among planners, especially local planners and practitioners, not recognizing this as a legitimate claim of the urban poor, not recognizing this as a socioeconomic political context, which is depicting reality of urbanism in the global south and Africa in particular. Mode of urbanization, which is inevitable and response to development of exclusion, socioeconomic and cultural entities. Informality represents initiatives of the poor, right to the city, they cannot be disposed of. Poor producers and reproducers of space in urban areas cannot be ignored by the former, which have been ignored by the former planning and land management system and practice. But there's to date little regard to informality in urban land use planning and management. And this is part of the problem which necessitates the need for reform to make sure that informality takes the center position in the plan of land uses in the countries. Because it's a phenomenon which is across the countries. In Tanzania and many other countries, accounting for over 70% of the built-up urban areas. Therefore, it's a force to reckon with. These are some of the attempts thinking big, and our planners and policymakers in Dar es Salaam thinking that they could build a city, modern city, which can attract, which can revolutionize the urban setting and change the cities, become modern as you see the Dubai, the Singapore kind of models. And these were designed by foreigners, and the idea of the government was to build a capital city, another city center, another CBD across the Dar es Salaam city center, which is across the creek, which you can see there on the left top. Across that, that's where they wanted to build this city. And the city center which exists is just adjacent about a stone throw from this one here. Of course, this has not been realized. It proved impossible to implement because the rights of the people on the ground, informal settlement which exists, were not taken into account. And you can imagine these designs, the resource capacity required to implement them would have been enormous and would completely shut down the other sectors of the urban development in the country. This was another city image which was being thought of to be built downtown Kawe, not very far from the city center, about 6 kilometers, which was to be built in this area. And it was being built from a collaboration between National Housing Corporation and a real estate investor from the Emirates. But it has been going slow because of the funding problems, and it has not been much has not been achieved. There are some structures which have come up, but they have not been realized much. What I'm trying to say is that apart from this, if you go to Nairobi, Tatu City in Nairobi, go to Accra, there are a lot of go to Angola, new towns ideas, satellite town ideas been one of the ideas which have been very much propelled by the multinationals as well as investors in real estate sector to attract and to lure the policymakers and planners in these countries that they can change their urban framework through this modern icon structures which would attract investment, which would change the picture of the urban and create modernity, which is the desire of many policymakers. Unfortunately, this has not been achieved much. And even in those countries where satellite cities have been built, there have been a lot of problems to get the properties used by the locals. How did this reform and study undertaken? We selected countries, the World Bank selected countries in the region which will be examined, including Kenya, Zambia, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, and Rwanda and Tanzania. But I'm only looking at Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, and Ethiopia. These are the countries I didn't look at. I have the report, but I look at. Commissioned a local expert practitioners within these countries to make a study and researcher to review the country-specific interventions. We commissioned planners, researchers from universities and the countries to go through the study of those countries, looking at 8 parameters, 14 parameters, which they will then report back in the form of a report on how they are performing, what has been done and when. Reviewed secondary data and information sources, interviewed and discussed with practitioners and academicians in countries to verify the report. The report were, once they were compiled, they were submitted to group of stakeholders, essentially practitioners and academics, to verify, to confirm the observations. And then country review of the report by the stakeholders. This was very important stage. This is basically what was done by, and then this report was submitted, and I reviewed the report and then prepared a compilation and discussion about synthesis of what actually is coming out of these reports. This is what the task was required to do by the World Bank. The analytical parameters which were used are expansion, urban expansion infrastructure. Is it being done transparently and with respect to rights of the land occupiers? The right of land occupiers being respected? Change of land use. The changes of land use receiving public inputs in terms of participation, in terms of being consultative. Change of land use, actual development. Is the changes on the ground reflected of actual development in the land use plans vis-a-vis the actual development? Policy vis-a-vis low-cost housing. Are there policies which subscribe to the idea to promote and provide low-cost housing for the poor and services? Land use plans expansion in large cities. Are land use plans directing and shaping urban expansion in large cities? Are planning process in this cities coping with urban growth? Planning permission, building permission, appropriate, affordable, and compliance, meaning that can people secure planning permit as fast as they want without, and are they affordable? The procedures, efficiency in building permit, time and cost taken to secure building permit. Are formalization of urban residential housing feasible and affordable? Are the ongoing formalization feasible and affordable? People, they have to pay for the cost of surveying and planning. Are they affordable? Informal tenure in cities, viable strategy. Is there a viable strategy for tenure security and infrastructure provision and housing? These parameters were formulated by World Bank. We discussed them and agreed that this would be feasible and that we can try to apply them. Some of them were applied systematically, others were left out because they couldn't make they couldn't make very sound observation on the ground. Therefore, as we will see later, they were selectively used in some cases. Finding from Tanzania, regularization and formalization of policy exist. The Tanzania has provided policy and law to formalize and regularize informal settlements. And in practice, this is being done in some settlements. But lack of resources is impeding sound development on the ground. Secondly, physical planning acts provide for decentralization of planning. But to date, the ministry is a very active player and in control of land use planning in many cities in the country, which means decentralization has not functioned as expected. Housing Mortgage Finance Act has been provided, has been put in place to facilitate unit title in those people building condominiums and multi-story building. But this is not really helping the urban poor who are building the informal settlements. It's largely for the middle and high income, which means it's not really making any impact on the housing for the poor. Mandatory engagement of community stakeholder and land use planning. Yes, this has been put in place, but retreat to master planning, which the government has decided to, and resistance to adapt strategic planning challenges community participation. Master plan is still done under classical thinking and where the government can plan and expect to, with a little consultation of the communities. But strategic plan was a different concept, which was initially propagated by the UN Habitat, UNEP in Dar es Salaam, but it was not adopted by the government because the master plan was seen to be a more authoritative and more legal tool. Strategic plan was said to be too flexible to constitute a framework for guiding cities. And this is unfortunate because a lot of resources and time was spent to try to institutionalize this concept of strategic plan, not only in Dar es Salaam, in several other cities in the country, with a huge support from UNDP, Habitat, and UNEP. Unfortunately, the government later abandoned the concept. Overall, little political and technical inertia to transform urban land use plan and management. As you can see, ideas of satellite cities still being floated, and weak local government. Local government have been weakened because of strong central government, especially during the last government, which decentralized a lot of opportunities for local government to mobilize resources, and powers of local government were really curbed. And this is very unfortunate. And therefore, resource sparsity is really hunting local government, and the local power relations, central local power relations is another problem. With the resource limitation to local government, there is always a contestation between local government and central government, especially in terms of powers, responsibilities, and capability to provide services, which has been highly embedded among local governments in the country. In Kenya, Constitution provide the new Constitution 2010 a very, very dynamic tool. It provides for decent housing for all, decentralized urban plan and development in cities and urban area act. This is a very important milestone developed in Kenya. Integrated country development plans. They've adapted integrated development plans as a key framework for budgeting and spending, meaning all countries have to prepare development plans as basis for spending and getting allocation from the central government, which is quite a progressive step. Integration of informality. Initially, Kenya did not approve informal system, but they've adapted this in the land policy 2012, upgrading and formalization of policies and laws to adapt and to integrate informality in the policies in the urban development. Mandatory engagement participation of communities land use planning. This has been provided, including monitoring and evaluation procedures to check whether or not people have been really engaged in participation. Mechanism for public hearing, appeals, lodging claims, and at county level have been put in place according to the Act, but little political commitment to systematically implement the reforms. Vested interests are some of the handicaps for implementing systematically the reform which has been adopted in Kenya. Ethiopia, the urban planning proclamation of 2008, one of the key statutory elements, instituted transparent public hearing before approval of all plans, which was an important milestone. Citizen participation in land use plan and preparation, like in other countries. Pro-poor housing policy put in place. Adapted integrated development plan also, like other countries, like Kenya and Zambia. Protection against expropriation without compensation. This has been put in the law. Equal security to men and women for property occupiers, but the reality is different. It's not true that women and men have equal property rights. It's not true that protection and expropriation is being done without compensation. The compensation being paid is very little. I'll come to that. Informality continues despite the eviction. A lot of people, those who have been in Addis recently, they will see a lot of building coming up in the old city which was predominantly informal. New building coming up, 3, 4, 5-story building, condominiums. But these condominiums are not really affordable by the poor, the people who are being displaced from these areas. At the same time, there's a lot of resistance among those who are occupying these informal settlements to be displaced because they are being disconnected from livelihood sources and they are being paid inadequate compensation. There is little political will to protect, therefore, rights of the informal settlers. Expropriation without adequate compensation continues, and disregard of informal properties in registration. In some countries, Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya, property in the informal sector are being registered under regularization, formalization. But in Ethiopia, informal properties are not registered and disregarded, at least at the time we are undertaking this study. Proper housing built are unaffordable. The multi-story buildings which are supposed to be pro-poor, to support the poor urban poor and affordable by the bulk. 90% of the urbanized cannot afford this housing. Therefore, they are not really catering for the people who are displaced in these localities. Lack of mechanism to ensure and to audit public participation. There's no mechanism in place for auditing and ensuring that the so-called public participation and auditing in planning and land uses can be analyzed. In Zambia, they have a Town and Country Planning Act, which has been make formal planning, make the planning of customary land mandatory, which was not there before. Constitutional rights to adequate housing and the right of squatter informal settlements provided, and at least 15% of the annual budget to be dedicated for housing. It's a big shift and milestone. Men and women access to land and use urban land. 30% of land is ring-fenced to supply for women. That to increase quality to access to land by women especially, which is a big also milestone. In Tanzania, we have equal supply, equal allocation of land to men and women. But in practice, this is not realized much because many of the applicants, women, they do not apply, they apply, but they don't get that priority during the allocation. Most of the land is given to men, and the idea is that men claim to hold the land on behalf of their spouses also, which is a bit complicated, but in Zambia, they've been able to ring fence 30% of the land to be supplied to women. Town country planning tribunal established to support and to assist the minister in dispute resolution, which is another organ which can make the system more transparent. Integrated development plan adapted, integrate economic and social planning to ensure coordination, statutory recognition of the informal and planned settlement and squatters as special treatment areas is another progressive development in Zambia. Regularization, formalization, they are issuing 30 years leases, which is actually a short term, longer than any other country in the region. 30 years lease for the informal property, which is quite a long time. Land use planning and management system and practice still highly centralized. That's another weakness. And the implementation of the reform, weakening the implementation of the reforms. Severe resource constraint like other countries and other capacity deficits, including human resource. Little political will to implement and enforce the reforms. Across the countries, we are seeing little political commitment to implement the reform. Very good in policy and action, but very good in policy and laws and regulations, but very little in action. This was an idea to try to grade the countries. We have several diagrams on this, with the D being the lowest in terms of performance and A being the best. And there is only one country, Zambia, which scored A in terms of viable strategy for informality and tenure security. The rest of the countries are ranging along B, which is actually good, but excellent is along those one country there. And other countries are on D's and C's, which shows little implementation, little enforcement, and little realization of the reforms across the countries using the dimensions which we presented earlier. Reflection on the reforms. The institutional reform in these countries have invariably changed the land use planning and management policies, legislation, structures, and protocols inherited from the colonial time. What we are saying is that if you compare what was there before the colonial or before these reforms, changes have been made on the ground. There's been this a move towards changing this, including regulation standards, which were inherited from the colonial period. This is a good progress. And most of the issues which address refer to the policy legislation and standards, public or citizen participation, housing right of the informal settlers and squatters, formalization, organization, and recognition of informality, monitoring plans of citizen engagement, and integrated development plans as a protocol or tool for facilitating cross-sector coordination of actors involved in planning of the city. These are major areas which have been undertaken by the countries if you look across. Security of tenure property rights in informal settlements, officially acknowledged in Tanzania, Zambia, and Kenya, right direction, this is right move. but not adequate to address the informality, which is the major force propelling the city's transformation. Reforms focusing on major urban centers, secondary cities, and small centers left out. These are the cities and centers which are receiving the bulk of the migrants from rural areas. And these are the cities also which are likely to grow into future urban centers of tomorrow in terms of major cities. Therefore, they are the major recipients of migrants. For many years, this has been the case, but they are not received. These reforms have not been effected in the secondary and small towns. Most countries have put in place statutory instruments that facilitate decentralized local government institutions with the planning powers and resource mobilization, but in practice, LGAs are weak financially and dysfunctional and increasing tendency to centralize. This is a typical situation in Tanzania, where a lot of move has been taken by central government to decentralize decision-making processes. Unfortunately, this is undermining governance, it's undermining democratic rights, and it's undermining local government institutions, especially performance to deliver services to their local communities and enhancing accountability among them. Most local governments in Sub-Saharan Africa lack resources, capacities, and land use planning. For land use planning management, land use planning is still highly centralized. Most countries have put in place pro-poor housing and servicing policies. However, the standards and regulations are unaffordable. This is the case in Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Ethiopia. Despite the existence of statutory and policy provision to support public participation in plan and implementation, citizen engagement remains weak across the countries. In Kenya, there's been attempted to provide even a mechanism for engaging with those who are handicapped, but the auditing process and the vested interest of the affluent people has been very much affecting this decision to engage with the local communities to get their right on the agenda. Reforms, legislation, protocols, regulation are hardly systematically enforced. We've seen that one. Adoption of IDPs and system without the necessary commitment to the centralized part of government can make little or no difference. Integrated development plans can make a sense when local government are given mandate and powers to coordinate and to interact across actors in the ground level. But this has not been the case, and therefore IDPs have not made a difference in terms of changing in land use planning and management. Institutional multiplicity, including overlapping mandates, local government, central government decentralizing and providing for local government to act on land use planning management, at the same time swapping powers and deciding to undertake all activities while government remain without much to do in terms of even enforcing the bylaws and regulations. Lack of transparency and public awareness about value the planning adds to land use change across the countries. The local communities do not recognize and appreciate planning as a tool which can enhance their value of their land. And therefore, there's no demand-driven for planning, which would be expected in many countries. But in this region, we have no demand-driven. Most of the plans are prepared by local government, by central government, and or agencies of central government, private firms, but it's not driven by the demand by local community or local government in appreciation of the value which is added to land once it's planned. Lack of transparency and little public awareness about the value. That's constitutional recognition of right of adequate housing, equality of men and women in urban land access, and right of informal settlers is a move towards the right direction. Food for thought. What am I deriving in terms of issues and controversy which we have to look at? Faith in the importance of planning, more important now than it was due to the financial crisis of 2008. Market will is not solving critical urban problems, but spatial planning Sub-Saharan Africa remain ineffective. What we are saying is that the faith in and importance of planning remains central. Despite all odds and the shortcomings which I've mentioned, we cannot do without planning. Planning is indispensable for sustainable development, social, economic, or spatial, and environmental. But this remains a weak link in the development of cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. The informal sector is not a residual process. but the mainstream force shaping and transforming cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's the modus operandi. And therefore, planners and policymakers have, in theory, acknowledged this, but there's little practice or action to support it. It is acknowledged, they cannot dispose it off. It's not possible simply. It's growing every day, but this realization and acknowledgement has not been in practice on the ground. The role of the state is indispensable. That's what I said earlier, statutory powers, policy enforcement, resource mobilization, but weak state is overshadowed by the private sector and the market. What I'm saying is that we have a situation where the state is weakened because of the strong market and its inability to regulate the market and the private sector, increasingly overriding powers in sub-Saharan cities. Real estate sector and informality, key forces transforming cities, and these are privately pushed forces. Land grabbing, speculation, violation of regulation standards, and expansive urban growth, which is costly to retrofit, especially in terms of providing basic services. In a land use planning system, this is a cost we are paying. The government, local and central are weak and handicapped and unable to exercise regulatory roles, continue disregard of grassroots potential regulating informal sector. On one hand, government is weak, both central and local, and is unable to regulate the market. But on the other hand, there are grassroots institutions which are regulating informal system, especially securing public needs where necessary. But these institutions are not able to withstand the market, especially when the market heats up in terms of land value and prices. They almost fall apart because they can no longer fight the strong influence of the market and private sector. And therefore, they cannot be trusted without the support of the central government or local government. There's no standard models yet or consensus about how the adequate approach to land use planning and management is responsive to current urbanism in Global South. This is a challenge in the practice, in the theory, and in the discussion across scholars and researchers, that there is no as yet a model which can answer these questions we are talking about here, especially planning land use management in Global South. In Tanzania, Sub-Saharan Africa in general. This will, by and large, my opinion, will by and large evolve from within. We do not foresee transfer of knowledge and skills from outside to influence these countries, unless it's built from within. Imported concepts have a role to play, but have to be critically and carefully considered. Precedents of the historical experience from the early industrialization in Northwest Europe and North America are relevant, may offer important references. What I'm trying to argue is that the situation in many sub-Saharan African cities is not mirrored per se on the post-industrialization history in Europe and Latin America and in North America. But it is depicting, it's suggesting need for rethinking the strategy for intervention. It is suggesting that the business as usual model we have been adapting is not appropriate in our context. We need to rethink about this. And in the process of rethinking, we may borrow and leave from some of these experiences from the West, which affected the cities so much, including Berlin, you remember Barcelona, and other cities, very much affected, and they had to find options to cope with the situation after thousands of people died of cholera. Planning for strategic infrastructure critical. What we are seeing in many informal settlements, which are large part of cities in the sub-Saharan Africa, is lack of appropriate and simple and applicable areas where infrastructure can be provided if resources improve or if states and actors improve, the economic situation improve. Where do you provide this basic service? Sanitation, which is a critical and indispensable service in human settlements. Access roads not being provided at informal settlements. Some of them are so crowded that you cannot even go through two people along the same path. You have to go one after another. Therefore, what we are saying is that, what I'm arguing is that selective intervention to secure most critical public needs is critical. Said a plan of Barcelona, it did address the public hygiene and mobility requirements after massive death of people in those cities. Okay, may offer a lift to us to rethink about the way we intervene in the cities. Societal knowledge which exists, tacit knowledge, especially held by being applied by local communities in formal settlements, could be critical entry to regulate informality and reduce the gap between the formal and the informal system. Strategic partnership between grassroots actors and formal institutions is prerequisite. What I'm saying is that, as noted, we cannot bank on the informal grassroots actors alone. Neither can we bank on the formal system. The linkage is critical, and the collaboration and the partnership is critical. And this linkage is critical entry point, I think, for survival of our cities, especially in the short run, that we do not have the opportunity for resource which can turn around the process of what is going on in sub-Saharan cities now. What we may have is find a room for maneuver, which begins from the both systems and build a system which can cope, at least in the short term. And by short term, I don't know how many years I mean, but at least in the short term, we need an intervention which is bargaining between the formal and the informal systems of managing land. Future of planning planners does not lie in planning per se. What we are seeing in these cities is that it is not the planner who will make reforms which can make a change in these cities. It must be the state and other key actors, private and community, informed by multi-level governance principles. We appreciate, and we have to appreciate, that cities cannot reform in the Sub-Saharan Africa, cannot be reformed by planners alone. They thinking that planner has the power and responsibility. Yes, but alone they cannot make a change. Institutional reforms at supra level seem insufficient. You cannot reform institution at a municipal level, at a city level, and expect it to make a change. This ought to include changes to enhance accountability at the grassroots level, at ward, sub-ward, and local government levels. Without these reforms at the city level cannot make much. Grassroots actors and institutions are change agents that are filling the severe public deficit, capacity deficits. They can improve quality of outputs from the informal sector if recognized, nurtured, and deployed. What I'm arguing is that they have a potential, but this potential has to be grown and has to be cross-fertilized with the formal system so that it can perform better. The argument is that you cannot get rid of it, the informality, the informal actors. The best way you can do is to improve its quality in terms of what is offering particularly to the poor people, and filling the gap which is left by the public sector. Limited resource suggests that they need to identify limited strategic intervention areas and focus on focus on partnership to optimize the use of limited resources. What we are saying is that when you have limited resources like we have in our countries, it suggests the need for selecting limited intervention area. This is what happened in Europe immediately after industrialization, that you cannot cope with all, you cannot provide wishful thinking, the satellite cities, and expect that you can address urban problem with that kind of models. You have to select critical areas for intervention where limited resource can be spent to realize optimal results, at least to be able to do away with the threat, those effects, public health concerns, and other requirements which would be threatened once these are not taken into account before the settlement consolidate, before spread of the settlement reach a level, densification level, which cannot be retrofit. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Kombe, for very instructive background and context for urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the specifics of the research project. So I think we have about a half hour or so for questions and answer, Q&A or any discussion. I open the floor.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have a question. Do you have any examples of sort of these interventions of creating, you're talking about informal settlements and kind of legitimizing them. Do you have any examples of this in practice?
Think about it. Examples
of sort of formalizing informal settlements and like legitimizing them and
There are many examples in the cities which are taking place, but my critique of the informal regularization is that it's taking place without sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hello. Check.
Hello. 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 Yeah. What I'm saying is that I do not have examples here, but in many cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, there are examples of formalization, regularization. My critique in the context of Tanzania is that, unfortunately, this regularization, formalization is taking place in situ, which means that settlements are being regularized as they are, without really taking into account the planning requirements of these settlements, accessibility, area for infrastructure services. Individual, which means priority has been given to individual property formalization, identifying the individual property, surveying the land, and providing them with titles without regard to the public interest in land, which means they are not really retrofitting in planning sense. They are only retrofitting property rights of the individuals in documents to be able to collect more taxes and to be able to register and identify them. That's what is happening. And therefore, my position is that this system needed to be reviewed and to be overhauled because it has been politicized. The idea has been, in my opinion, the idea has been that to survey, to regularize as many settlements as possible to be able to reach a target where government can say we have done this and this and this and this. It has been politically motivated. Don't look into the other aspect of plan. It's very much focused on regularizing individual settlements and individual properties, which is, yes, good to provide property rights, but it's undermining the fundamentals of urban development and urban planning, because without a proper planning function, city cannot function. And if you're only formalizing that, if you are only concerned with the private property, the city is not private property, it's both private and public. And this must be integrated in a plan to be able to achieve sustainable development.
I had a follow-up to that question, Professor Kombe. Is these formalization, regularization programs and policies have been critiqued all over the world, for benefiting, certain demographics or benefiting the wealthy who take advantage of them. They seem to be, based on my understanding of the literature, which is probably not as deep as yours, they seem to be particularly ineffectual in the African context. So are there specifics or peculiarities about the urbanization process in Africa? That's how you started your talk, that would, suggest or undermine the effectiveness or the implementation of tenure formalization programs within the African context?
Yeah, there are definitely a number of factors. One is that, first of all, as I said before, this is a reactive intervention. It is coming after settlements has grown and developed, and even the law provided for settlements which are densely built, which have been consolidated, which is unfortunate because at that stage you cannot provide adequate system for circulation, for provision of public services in the later stages. One. Two, it is taking place following settlement growth, which means it's not able to proactively regulate the settlements, to provide for before the settlement consolidates. And therefore, it's not able to cope with the demand. The rapid growth of the cities and sprawling cities is far, far faster than what can be done by regularization, formalization in many cities. As such, it's not able to cope with urbanization, especially urban expansion, informal urban expansion. It's always following and is miles, miles, miles away from being able to cope with that one. Three, there are land tenure issues. Most of the informal areas, they are both customary and quasi-customary land rights. And this formalization is being resisted by settlers who are aware that once their property is formalized, they will be required to pay taxes, which means people are ready to get their property identified, but they are not ready to take the titles, which means titles are laying at the local office for years. Nobody is speaking the titles, but their property have been formalized technically in terms of being identified, being surveyed, and being identified and registered in the register, in the local register. But they have not picked the titles because they do not want to pay taxes. As of now, they are not paying any property tax. They're not paying land tax. But once they pick the title, they'll be required to pay land tax. Besides, once they get a title, they'll not be able to subdivide and sell as they are doing now, which means local communities are aware of the costs they are heading for, and they are reluctant to buy in this concept, at least at the stage of receiving the titles and maintaining the titles and being able to pay for the requisite fees to maintain the title.
Thank you.
Professor, thank you for coming to speak to us today. When discussing planning reforms in Kenya, you briefly described county development plans as like one of the tenets of land reform, of planning reform there. And I'm curious because this seemed to be one of the main things you outlined that wasn't specifically focused in a major urban area, but more generally across a country, like regardless of in an urban setting or a regional setting. And I guess I'm curious is do you think that it's likely that these kinds of reforms will become more frequent, or what do you think that these reforms are likely to be successful in achieving their objectives?
Mm-hmm. Stefan, can you translate what you said? I mean, can you paraphrase what you said exactly? I didn't follow the question.
You were asking, he was asking specifically about the what was the name of the plan?
That's right. My apologies. I'll try to. So you mentioned county development plans in Kenya. Can you tell us a bit more about their structure? What goals they are, what goals they set out to achieve, and whether you think they're likely to succeed at, and if that success is likely to be weighted more towards certain parts of the country than others, or sorry, does that clearer, or
Okay.
Okay.
Are you asking about the county plans in Kenya?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. In Kenya, they have a very progressive. They have adopted a very progressive law, the 2012 Planning and Land Act, 2010, the Constitution, the Land Act, the Urban Plan Act. They are all very dynamic tools, and really they emphasize and they promise a lot in terms of being able, providing even for mechanism to audit engagement and providing for requirement that counter plans and are integrated in the sense they include both economic and spatial, and will be constitute tools for providing resources allocation fund from the central government, which is a very big milestone in trying to ensure coordination of spatial and central and economic plans, which is a weak link again in the process, because once you have spatial and economic plans separated, then you are likely not to find much resources for the spatial planning. Most of the resources will be focused on the economic plan, even though economic plan has a bearing on the spatial aspects. In the Kenyan context, this is a big progress which has been made, but there are problems of getting this idea institutionalized, in the sense of receiving attention, receiving routine follow-up by all the counties. Therefore, there are at least from the report which were submitted, there is a reluctance among professionals to work as an integrated form in the kind of integrating planners, economic planners and spatial planners and other engineers to work together to prepare the plan. This reluctance is undermining integrated development plans in Kenya. Whether this can be resolved by government by institution is something I cannot make a assertion, but I think this is a challenge which they are experiencing. Bringing together the key actors to work together and decide and prepare plans which respect the norms of integrated planning and can facilitate allocation of funds and budgets by the government according to the plan.
Thank you, Professor Kombe, for a wonderful talk. I thought you did, you made us think so clearly along planning reforms which are focused on tenure regularization and why that's problematic. And then the need for planning for the public good, right? When you talked about infrastructure and upgrading in all those different ways. But you keep coming back in the future of the food for future thought kind of sections to the lack of governance mechanisms and the failure of decentralization reforms, right? Ghana used to be like the poster child at one point for decentralization reforms. And so I'm very curious to hear more from you about what you think that process of putting a governance system in place will take. I mean, is this going to be a lot of sort of small scale experiments at collaboration between community organizations, poorly functioning but still available local government, a planner or two who wants to be an advocate? Or do you think there's something bigger, that needs to be done? I see the World Bank is involved. The World Bank's always been involved, but that's a different story. But, I'm just curious what you're thinking about when you say governance needs to be reformed.
Really, thank you very much, Professor, for the question. It's a very interesting question because it's a question which is really hunting many people, planners and non-planners. What can we do to improve governance in the country? The gatekeepers of power are not interested very much to decentralize and to adapt. For example, decentralization in Tanzania has largely been failed because of the central government reluctance to give power to local government and accusing it of being corrupt, of being inefficient, of not being functional, and all of not having capacity when it is taking all the staff and decentralizing them to the ministries. Recently, they moved all the planners' accountability to the ministry. They remain the local government, but they are accountable to the ministry. Therefore, what I'm trying to argue is that, yes, intervention from below can make a small change, but really, unless we have a benevolent dictator who can see decision being made on the policy and legislation are implemented on the ground, a person who is committed to serious leadership of decentralizing power to the local government, I don't see ability of the local government to come out of this very difficult situation. I can't see resources flow into local level if the status quo continues where government leaders and top leaders are apprehensive to give powers to the local government, and they are scared, they don't want to see. And when there is even opposition, it becomes even worse, that the opposition areas are undermined completely. They don't get the services, they don't get the support necessary to make them vibrant and active players in the development of the country, which means the situation is complicated, but I see opportunities in both combination of bottom up and top down. But that's why I was arguing that central government is indispensable. And pressure group must continue pressing the government to realize this very important observation that without the decentralized government, without giving the power to the local government, which comprise elected and appointed people, we will not be able to break through. And the problem is growing day after another. And there is no way central government can deal with the problem at the local level without giving the local level adequate capacity and resources to be able to start and keep the position of monitoring and policy provision, regulation, but not really providing action on the ground. I see the opportunity. I don't see an opportunity where central government can be indispensable. I see a combination of central and local and a kind of a partnership which is supported very strongly by the government, central government commitment to decentralize. Without that, I'm afraid, because even the local institutions which are doing a lot of work now, they weaken as intensification of market increases. And they weaken as affluent people encroaches the settlement, start buying off certain area and buying off certain people. And this local institution can no longer regulate the land. And therefore, development become chaotic. And even the minimum services, area for basic services are provided are encroached upon by those people who are money and they can build large or they want to invest in other land uses. This is a problem which we're having. And that's where I see, that's my conviction that without the government intervention and support, informality on alone and the grassroots institution cannot make much, in my opinion, at least not sustainably. At the level of infancy, when settlements are starting, when they are still growing, when there are still densities are very low, market aggression is slow and it's not that much. Demand for land and market is not that much. They are very strong. They can make decisions. They are brokering a lot of decision making, and they are providing for basic areas like access roads, area for cemeteries, area for schools, and whatever. They are able to negotiate for that, the landowners and other people in the settlements, and there are success stories of that. But as market heats up, their power and responsibility become weak, and they are not able. Besides, they are not even empowered to decide to regulate land issues. They are only empowered to administer the local situation, local and kind of resolve conflicts, implement policies from this local government downward, but they are not responsible for issue of land, which means the decision not to give them powers on land is another very big factor which is undermining their capacity to be able to intervene. And they don't have the bylaws and regulations which they can use, which are tailored for the local, for the informal settlements to be able to regulate the settlements according to certain guidance which they will be given. This guidance does not exist in the formal settlements, which means it has been left as a world of its own and the local leaders themselves. Sorry.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Thanks for your talk, Professor Kombe. I have actually a related question to Professor Kutwa's question. You talked about the broader context in these 4 countries, and you focus on land reforms, of course. And I'm curious how you see these institutions, the sort of institutional reforms, in relation to broader democratic institutions in these countries. And you see the sort of land use management planning institutional reform more progressive than the democratic representational institutions in these countries broadly? Or are they more, are they sort of being hindered by a lack of democratic representation more broadly, or how do you see the relationship between land use planning and democratic representation?
I think there are varying conditions. If you look at the Kenya model, many of you who have followed up Kenya, even recent development in Kenya, you'd see Kenya, there is a higher level of maturity in terms of democratization. There is a higher level of tolerance and a higher level of government commitment to democratize and to practice democracy as it is, even in the local context, even if it's in the local context. But if you look at my country, Tanzania, the decision, the commitment of the government to democratize is not that much. The constitution we've been talking about over the last 10 years is far from being formalized and being completed and being approved by the government. There are a lot of reservations among the ruling party members to democratize and to provide for instruments which can enhance democratization. Deliberately because for vested interest. They are not the public interest, popular interest. They are largely vested interest. They will lose in some areas and they are not very keen to lose. So after all, they've been in power for the last 60 years, which means when I compare the two countries, I'll say, yes, you're right. Land use institutions, reforms which have been taken, land use institution can make a difference if democratic institutions are mature and developed or are concurrently being developed. What I'm saying is that if you have a democratic institution which are suppressing rights and obligation of institutions which are elected by people and are put in place by people, and I expect to be accountable to the people who put them in power, then it is very difficult to see how those land reform can make a big difference. There will remain pockets of success here and there, but they are not going. You are not going to see much in terms of wider implication to the development of cities and towns. Because, to me, I see democracy as essence and center of everything, especially commitment of the central government to democratize and support institutions which are elected and which are put in place by the people through democratic decisions-making processes. And if this is not being done, or if this is done in a system or in a way that is not systematically adhered to, and you often serving the vested interest of few, then you cannot see much in terms of development. The two are interconnected, in my opinion, and they would be critical to be handled together. They are complementary, I would say, so they are complementary. Without this complementarity, it's difficult to see the achievements of what we are envisaging in the land use reforms. Of course, there are cases where democratic issues are questioned, Rwanda, for example, but the strength of the power of the government is a small country on the other hand, but the influence of the government on decision-making is very high, and many things are done on the ground because the directive has been given by the central government to do A, B, C, D, E. Of course, there are challenges, much as they are not spoken about in terms of the land in the reforms which are being carried in place. If you read the literature, it tells you there is no informality in Rwanda, but we know all that is not true. Informality is dominant in Kigali in all of our cities, and there are fundamental questions and challenges of land management in Rwanda, including the rights of people who were there before, which have been not honored. But these are not written in the literature, because if you write in the literature, you are not popular in Rwanda at all. I had a student from Rwanda, a master student, who wrote about this, and he had a lot of problem to write to dissertation, one applicable and applied, which can be used at the university, and which can, the other which can circulate in the public in their country, because he will be in a very difficult position to argue for the reality of what he has seen in Kigali. And therefore, what I'm saying is that you can see the type of government we have, and the government we have in the region, and the problem which may arise in informing reforms and in implementing reform, where there is no willingness for transparency and the democratic governance. Or there is very little inertia towards that, at least.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Is there any selective intervention or planning strategies that the SSA has done differently from the rest of the world as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? I remember that you said that Barcelona had a public health safety plan that resulted from the cholera pandemic. So I was wondering if the SSA has any specific intervention plans that you could share with us, that's different from, that's been done anywhere else?
I didn't get the question very clearly. What you say? How do we relate that with the COVID-19?
Sorry.
I didn't get the question very clearly.
Okay. My question is, has the SSA done any specific selective intervention planning strategies that is a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're going through?
I would say no, at least not in Tanzania. I don't know in the other countries. We did a study in informal settlements, which are built about just after the pandemic, and we realized that actually what was done there is largely intervention by the grassroots institution to mobilize resources, support, medicament, food, and whatnot to support the poorest household in their settlements, because they know them, and to identify them and to be able to reach them. And the local government was providing water, providing facilities for hand washing in public areas, along shopping areas, along local bars and shops. That's all, but not really providing services to the poor people who would be highly affected because of pandemic. Therefore, I would say, in terms of reforms which are necessary to support these settlements, to provide for services, for example, to reach out to the poor areas which are crowded, where there are no basic water supply, for example, or drainage system. This has not been done. This is what maybe will be a lesson from the COVID, because these were the areas which were hit hard by COVID-19. And therefore, we only hope. The current government has become very developmental in many ways. It has become very progressive in many ways. There are many decisions which are now being made to support local communities, much as there are resource limitations. But the past government, which President Magufuli's government, was really undermining local initiatives in many ways, because it was not focusing on the local community interests per se. A lot of investment was being done on the larger part, on the larger major infrastructure and whatnot. That was the direction of the government then. Things have changed a lot. And we see a lot of change in terms of moving towards supporting local communities, initiatives of local communities. And the government seems to be committed to appreciate the role this community can play. And I think probably it's a lesson from COVID-19, which is one of the observations we made in the paper, that we need to rethink about our strategy for intervening in informal settlements, because these are really hotspots for COVID-19, especially where there are no sanitation and water supply services which are adequate, or which are at least appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kombe, for a very interesting overview of land reforms in Sub-Saharan Africa. You are very much embedded in the Western notions of planning, I think, and working with the World Bank. You referenced early industrialization in North America and Europe, as well as the need right now for Africa to carefully consider the import of other external models and really consider urbanism from within. But I was curious not to hear China mentioned, because of China's increasing involvement in Africa. And I wanted to go back to Ryan's question about the role of, or the relationship between democracy and land use planning. To what extent do these central leaders that you're talking about, not willing to decentralize, look to China as a model for an alternative that is not like Western European versions of democratic land use planning?
Thank you very much. It's a very difficult question, because first of all, I'm not very conversant with the Chinese mode of planning. I know it's very participatory, and at least it is thought to be very participatory in the discussions and like in all other circles. But I think we have not been able to learn from China in the urban planning and management per se, because China has not been very active in the planning in the country. China has not been very active in the investment in recent years in Tanzania. In terms of infrastructure, it has been very active as contractors, as implementers of projects funded by the Millennium Target, having support from the US, from the bilateral organization, Europe, from the World Bank, very much playing a role in the implementation, but not in the funding. In terms of funding, and it's very limited input, and in planning, I know there are colleagues who have been studying in China in planning area, and there are still those who are doing PhD in China. I know some colleagues from Dodoma University, from Dodoma Institute of Development Studies. And the impact, but the Chinese impact in planning has been very limited because of the little interaction between planners and planners in Tanzania and policymakers in Tanzania and those in China who are responsible for planning and management especially. There's been very little interaction. I do not remember a project or research aspect which have been carried out by the two institutions, by the two countries, not even. I know they have established a center at the University of Dar es Salaam, Confucius Center, I think. They have established another unit somewhere in the ministry, not for planning, but a coordinating unit of some kind. But in terms of investment, Chinese investment in the country, in Tanzania particularly, in infrastructure, in planning related aspects, in economic development, it's not been significant. There are a lot of Chinese companies which are investing in mining, in industries, but not in terms of the public infrastructure services or planning per se.
Thank you so much, Professor Kombe. So interesting. So with all of this level of careful thinking about what planning can't do, and the sites where planning needs to concentrate, you ended your talk talking about the ways in which we need to think about the state and communities and the market and that sort of nexus. How do you think about planning education? What's important, what's crucial, especially in a field where we have put so much emphasis on planning, on land use management tools. And so how do you think about it? And maybe even ending, how do you navigate that in your collaboration with Dortmund in Springs as a program? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, plan education is an area where reforms are required, where reforms have not been effected because of the slow response to the reality on the ground. When the UNDP and the UNEP wanted to reform planning in Tanzania by adapting strategic planning as a tool which can be negotiated by key players, key stakeholders, and where developmental issues in a plan are derived from working session with stakeholders and therefore put together as a plan finally and built into the strategic plan and prioritized by the community, by the stakeholders. This idea was very much brought in, and we played a very big role as a university to support this propagation of this concept and idea. But at the ministry, which is the custodian of planning the country, Minister of Lands, Housing and Human Settlement Development, there was a resistance to adapt this policy for two or three reasons. First of all, it was an alien thinking which they were not conversant with, and therefore many did not understand and appreciate the concept. Two, the development of this concept did not take into account the need to convince gatekeepers, all gatekeepers. You see, the role of the entry point of the project of this transformation was the local government. And this was a mistake in my opinion, because local government was not then, or is not until now, the custodian of planning. Custodian of planning in the country is the Minister of Lands, Housing and Human Service Development. It formulates the policies, laws, and regulations, and it approves the plan finally. Much is centralized, but finally the plan has to be approved by the ministry. And the mistake which we made was to think that you can reform a system through intervention of local government. This was a failure, and we never succeeded. The second reason why the minister was adamant was because of they considered the strategic plan as a too flexible tool to replace master plan, which is, to them, it is considered a legal instrument, which the minister has power and the minister can decide to change only. It's not nobody else can make the change on the plan. And this was a very important power issue, which minister was not ready. At least the gatekeepers are the ministry, director himself, director of urban planning, and these people were not ready to forego. And this, because strategic plan did not have the same structure and the same tool for approval by the ministry. It was a stakeholders-driven process and the stakeholder-driven plan, which would be implemented and would be flexibly responding to the changing situation over time, but with the minimum set with certain minimum requirements for certain things which have to be considered structural and cannot just be changed by stakeholders as when they want, like major land uses which are required for expansion of airport, harbor, areas which are fragile, which have to protect and. This concept failed because of the process, the way the entry point for the process, and the little appreciation by the minister officials. Over years, planning some reform have been effected at the training, at least in the planning education, at least at the institute, at the university, where ideas have been hybrid between the strategic plan and the master plan has been developed, and this is what is being taught now. But there are still questions which are very difficult to answer in terms of the conceptual premises for developing a solid knowledge-based planning which can respond to the local context. What I've been talking about earlier, that we do not as yet have a system, a concept of how we can develop cities in the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, and what entry point is important to be able to do that. It's been debated a lot by scholars in the West especially, and very little in the local because of the little linkages with those scholars who are discussing and who are undertaking research in this area. I think there is a fundamental gap still, that one of conception theoretical framework that can explain the development of city in the global south, which we need in order to be able to make inroads into the practice, and in order to be able to convince doubting Thomases that we need to reform. And this cannot be done only by practice. It has to also to be, there must be also a convincing theoretical framework which can inform ideas and practice, and which can provide the basis for learning and for widening and for critique also of whatever we are going to do. This is a gap which I see, and where I think our collective initiatives are required to be able to explore and come out with ideas which can really explain and which can find solution appropriate and responsive to the local context which we have. I do not emphasize context-specific ideas, but I'm talking about a concept which can capture the reality of development in the global south, and that can explain and it can provide the basis for answering difficult questions which do not have answers as yet. To me, I find this is important point because in an academic institution, in a knowledge generation process, you cannot, and we cannot underestimate the importance of theory, at least in explaining what you would expect to happen or what can happen in certain situations. And this is important for us. Therefore, I fully agree that is a challenge which we have. It's an area where we need reform, but we need collective efforts from both the West and South. And that's why I said that precedents of the urbanization in the West cannot be ignored. In an attempt to develop a new concept for the South, we cannot claim that those ideas from the West are absolute and they do not make sense. In my opinion, they have room and they have a place to play, and they are needed to inform and to assist in thinking and reflecting of what is actually important for us and where can we pin it in terms of theoretical grounding for that. And therefore, I think it's important to hybridize and think collectively in this process.
Great. I think we're basically out of time. So I'd like to thank Professor Kombe once again for joining us this afternoon, and appreciate him coming here on the IAD Visiting Fellowship and spending some time at Cornell.
Thank you.